Creating shaders and texturing is an integral part of the 3D production process. Bad texturing will ruin the best models and will make your CG appear extremely artificial. Texturing, like modeling, requires understanding of your subject matter and how to go about recreating it in the digital format. Never try and texture an object off the top of your head. At the very least, do some research on the internet as to what your object should look like. Better yet, do your own research, go on a field trip and take your own photos. Creating shaders and textures is not as simple as painting the colours you see. When creating materials or shaders, we have many different attributes that we must define values for. Most of these are probably going to need a texture. Therefore, when we look at an object, we should try and analyse how the different material properties combine to give us an overall look. We must start off by asking ourselves certain questions about our subject matter. What material is the base substance of our surface? We will very rarely find a pure material in our environment without sign of wear and tear, but knowing what properties to give your object before applying textures is a good start. What is the texture of our material? In the real world, texture is the adjective of the material, i.e. rusty metal. Textures are used similarly in 3D. We map textures to material attributes in order to control them. We can create textures for many attributes in Maya. One of the main attributes that people first think of is colour. There are many factors in deciding the final colour of an object in a render, including light, reflections, shadows, etc. The colour attribute, however, is like the basic pigment of your object. Try to make your colour channel contain only colour information. Avoid things like highlights and shadows. Can light pass directly through your geometry without scattering? Is there anything on the surface inhibiting transparency, i.e. dirt, scratches or paint? Is there partial transparency? What percentage of light can pass through? Transparency can be controlled with a black and white texture. Another quality to watch out for on a surface is its bumpy quality or surface detail. Are there dents, nicks or scratches that will cause light to reflect in different ways? What kind of miniature highlights and shadows are created by this detail? These details can be added with bump mapping. Smooth surfaces are generally shiny. Are there any highlights on the surface? What colour are my highlights? Are they sharp or soft, big or small, bright or subtle? We have a number of specular qualities on materials with which we can create specular shading. We can also create texture maps in order to control this non-uniformly across the surface. Another product of smooth surfaces is reflection. Does the surface have a reflective quality? How strong is the reflection? Is it blurred or is it tinted? Reflectivity can be faked with reflected colour or simulated with ray tracing in Maya. Other more complex material attributes can be seen in the real world or simulated in Maya. We can create textures for some of these, or it may just be a case of inserting a value. As we train our artistic eye, we will begin to spot them. Ambient colour, incandescence, diffuse, translucence, or the ability to create refractions. We will be looking at these in more depth during Lighting and Rendering Week. Creating accurate materials and textures in Maya is only half the story. Achieving this alone will immediately stand out as being a little too perfect. Dirt, weathering, and general imperfections are the key to creating believable textures that will ground your objects in the real world. Not only creating imperfections in our textures and shaders, but also applying them in believable ways. Places exposed to the outdoors gathering moss or weathering, such as drips down a wall, or objects with a lot of human interaction, such as well-worn paths and regularly used handles. It's no good putting dirt in places you wouldn't expect it, or even putting too much dirt, or even too little. Outside the realms of VFX and photorealism, textures can be used to set a mood, style or look. You may exaggerate certain surface qualities, or remove others to make a point, but paying attention to the real world will keep your environments and characters believable.
I'm going to start this tutorial just by going and setting our project. So File, Project and Set. And what I'm looking for is the Mustang Distressing, because within the scene file, go and open that up, we have a start scene, the Mustang Distressing _00. And within here you can see that we have the Mustang aircraft that we've been doing quite a bit of work on, and we also have the color map that we created from all of the projections. Now the purpose of this tutorial is to now take that color map and make it look real. At present, it is literal blocks of color. There's no surface quality, there's no scratches, there's no rust, there's no variation of tone, and the way that we're going to make this aircraft look real is to take the time, use various images, be they reference, be they textures, combine them together to create a color map as well as a bump map as well as a specular map to place onto this aircraft to actually make it look real. So I'll begin with the start file. If I go to File and Open, you'll find within the Mustang Distressing project, we have a textures folder, and within that we have a Photoshop files. Now this is where I'm going to store all of the Photoshop files we'll be working on, and therefore they'll be separate to the actual images that we're going to use as either a bump map, color map, spec map. We'll begin by taking a quick look at what we already have. Now over in the layers here, you can see that for each decal we have a separate layer which allows me to turn each one on and off, and we also have separate layers for the green paint, the red paint, and of course the checker. Now we're going to end up using a large number of layers throughout this tutorial, so it's paramount that we right from the start keep this clean, tidy and well labeled. So I'm going to begin by taking all of my decals and creating a new group for them. And once I've done that, I'm just going to rename this the original decal. Now I find a lot of the time that I'm going to be duplicating these and working on the copy. Some people like to do this, other people don't. I just find it's pretty nice to always keep within there the original starting images, just in case we need to refer back to. So I'm going to take all of those, drop them into the group, and the underbelly needs to go in there as well. Move that up, drop that in. I'm also going to rename the shape 6, which is the panel detailing layer. This is going to be a very important layer throughout the whole project. So you can see turning that on and off. And last but not least, we've obviously got the green, the red paint and the front checker that I can just drag and drop into a new group here. Okay, so now that that's all organized, what we'll do is we'll just save this now. And we'll start to look at some of the source images that we have and how we're actually going to create the texture. Okay, so I'm going to minimize this and just go to File and Open. Now within inside the source images, we've got a number of folders here. We've got the reference images and we've also got texture reference. We have the Mustang color underscore base projection, which is what we had on the original aircraft right at the start, and some final maps, which is just examples of what we will create. The thing that I'm interested in at the moment, however, is the reference folder. So let's just go in there. And I've got the 4 images that we used throughout the projection tutorial. I'm going to begin by just looking at the Mustang takeoff. That's going to give me the best reference to begin with. If I open this up, we'll have a look at what we have. If I zoom in, you can see that across the body and the wing, we've got this metal paneling, which we're aware of because we have the panel detailing layer. We've got rivets. You can see that the surface is fairly shiny. It's got areas that vary in terms of the color. So not all the panels are the same color. The engine here has sprayed maybe some oil or just smoke down the side. There seems to be kind of denting within the panel work. Starting to fade around here, so we're losing the gloss off of it. Again, we've got the glass, we've got the various areas of paint. Now, as far as this reference image goes, it's good to give us a base to start on, but this still looks a little bit too new in comparison to what I want to go for. So within the source images again, this time under texture reference, you'll find a large number of images that we're going to use throughout the course of the tutorial to get the look that we're wanting from our texture. Now there's a couple in here that I'm going to look at straight away just to get an idea, and it's all of these bottom 6. Okay, let's just open that up. Okay, so the first thing that we have is this scratches JPEG. Now, it's very excessive and a bit over the top for what we're going to be aiming for, but it's a good idea to understand what happens to paint when it gets scratched off. How does rust appear underneath it? We can also use this image, which shows how rust tends to build out from connections of panels, and as we're working with a lot of paneling throughout this sort of idea is going to be important throughout the whole tutorial. Here we have a close-up of paneling. Now whether or not this is an aircraft or a ship, it's not entirely clear, but again you can see the variation in the plate color, you can see the rivets, you can see the rust down in the seams. One more version of paneling, different rivets, maybe some dirt and dust, and that appears to have been streaked possibly by rain. Okay, so it's all of these little things that we're going to have to start bringing in to really look close at real life objects. Again, a train, not a plane, I know, but it's fairly similar in some respects. This paneling on the side has a kind of close relation to the paneling that we saw on the original source image. If I go and bring that back up. Okay, yes, this is glossier, but we're going for the color and texture to begin with, so this would be quite a good starting point for us. And so I'm going to leave that at the side. And last but not least, we have the bare metal image that has some scratches on it. Now again, it's not entirely the look that we're going for, but these scratches, these fine areas of scraping, chips, variation in color, we can use later on when we begin to actually remove paint from our aircraft. Now the first place to start is the paneling, as I say. Now due to the nature of the aircraft, a lot of the techniques we'll be using, you would use on the wings, the tail, the main body. So in this tutorial, I'm just going to concentrate on the wing down here. And then in your own time and afterwards, you can continue to work on the other parts of the body and the other wing and just get used to the techniques that we'll be using and even start to experiment yourself. So the panel detailing is going to be fairly hard because we want each panel to look different. We also want to be able to have a shadow in between, perhaps, where they join, because they don't fit flush together. That's not the look that I want. So I'm going to begin by just taking the marquee tool, the square marquee, and I'm going to drag across this section here. Just hit Control and C to copy, and I'll now maximize this area and move on to working here. I'm going to turn off all of the decal for the moment because that's all I need. I just need this paneling. I'm even going to turn off the paint just to keep everything clear. So how can I get that accurately into one of these areas? Well, if I go to my 1 tool, I'm going to drop my tolerance right down to 1 for this. Enter and ensure that I'm working on a layer. Now when I hit select, and I'll just zoom in to show you, because of the settings, it's just able to pick up on that very fine line that separates each level. And then I can go to edit and paste into, and I get this section that I copied from the original image being dropped into that area. Now it's good to start getting used to all of the shortcuts as well, so you can see that to do a paste into would just be Shift, Control and V. And I'm going to move out. Now that's all very well, but if we go to edit and transform, and let's go to scale, you can see the size of the image that I originally copied. What I'm going to do is just bring this down, shrink it slightly. You can see even then actually I'm starting to get some nice detailing. There's a couple of dents within the side of the train door that look fairly nice. You know, maybe something's hit it, or maybe it's just been dented by somebody walking on top of the wing. And you can choose which way round we're going to have this. I'm going to leave it as is just for the moment and place it in. Now unfortunately, and it can be a little bit time consuming, we need to do this for the rest of the wing. As I say, that's all I'm going to concentrate on, and it will be a repetition of the steps that we've just covered. So once we've copied this area, we can continually just paste in one after the other. The only difference is it'd be quite nice to variate every now and again and choose a different panel section on the train, just to add a greater variation. I'm just going to do this once more, just so you're happy with the technique, and then I'll speed up the video just so you don't have to sit through me pasting into the whole wing. So what I would do, of course, is ensure that I'm on the panel detailing layer, magic wand, and just select the central area. Okay, just ensure that it's there, and obviously Control Shift and V, and I'm able to paste the image in. Now, because of the shape that I'm working with there, if I go to Control T, that gives me the ability to scale, rotate, move all in one function. So I'm going to rotate this around. Okay, want to be careful. You can see there's the dent reappearing. That's what I mean by might be fairly nice to variate this slightly. Okay, perhaps a little bit big. Let's bring this down to about 80%. Return to apply it. Okay, so that's my second panel in. So continue to do this, and once I've done the whole wing, I'll slow the video back down because we'll be coming across a new technique. So that's the panels now created. Of course, you can see that we have a large number of new layers, and having to go through and label all of them is a bit inefficient. We don't really need to do it. What we could do is just take all of those layers, drag them into the folder here, which will create a new group, of course. And I'm going to call this group the left wing panel layers. Okay, so we've now blocked out that whole area. Of course, if you wanted to, you can do it across the whole aircraft. As I pointed out earlier though, I'll only be doing this wing. And at the minute it's looking okay. We're going to have to now come in and begin to use some of the layer properties and duplication of layers to start getting that shadowing and an even greater variation of color. Now that the panels are done, we can start to think about the shadows. I do have the panel detailing lines here, but eventually what I'm going to do when we apply this onto the model is turn that off, because although we want a visible scene, we're going to create the scene via a bump map, and therefore we'll get shadows within Maya. But we also want to create it by using some sort of color detailing around all the edges. Now, to go around and paint all the edges would just take too long. There's ways around it. Plus, we've also got to think, would all of them have exactly the same shadowing, the same coloring? Now, what we can do using the layers that we've created for the wing panels, we're going to start duplicating these and working on them. All right, so first things first, what I'm going to do, I'm going to start thinking about maybe this panel, and this panel, because they're definitely overlapped by the second panel, I think it was, that we put in. So I'm just going to come down and see if I can find, okay, so that one there can be, okay, so it's layer 14 and layer 18 that I'm going to concentrate on first. So I'm going to show you two different methods. Now, first of all, we can get a greater color variance between each panel. So I'm going to take layer 14, which, as I've shown, is this one, and just drag it down into the new layer. Now, it will create a copy, and obviously it's already got a vector mask applied to it. And we're going to use that to our benefit. Now, at the moment, there is no difference because we have no blending options. If, however, I just open this up, what I'm going to use is multiply, right? And you can see already what's happened. Now, I can come in and obviously begin to affect the opacity of this. All the time I'm working in the vector mask. Okay, you do need to ensure that you're selecting between the two. Just gonna maybe variate the opacity, which is fairly simple. What I can also do is perhaps pick a brush, and we're going to pick something that may give us some scratching, worn away look. So maybe one of these, or even perhaps say this brush here. I'm going to stick with the kind of splatter. Now that's all very good, but I might want to variate the brush itself. So I can come into the brushes here and decide that I'm going to reduce or increase the spacing, I should say. And I think that'll be okay to start with. I'm also going to just drop the opacity or the flow on the brush itself. Now, if I'm working within the mask, let's just close that down. You can see that by painting in black, what I'm doing is removing areas of the copied layer, therefore giving me a greater appearance on the underneath. So if I turn that off, you can see the difference between the two already. Okay, now we're going to want to do that on a few of the panels, not on every one, of course. Let's keep some looking a little bit different. The other thing we can do, of course, is on layer 18, which is this one. We're going to use some of the layer properties or the layer styles. So I'm just going to double click on the layer. And what I'm going to do to begin with is turn on what's known as the inner shadow. Now, when I do that, you can see straight away what's happened. All right. It's a more extreme version of what we've done here. It's very obvious now that there's a connection or a missing area between these two panels. And within the, if you click on the inner shadow style, we get the properties or the ability to adjust the appearance of it. Now, straight away, the distance is what we want to look at. Now, the distance is obviously the distance of shadow. And because we want an overall appearance of shadow around every single edge, let's just drop that down to 0. And you can see how that's now given me an equal edge. The thing is, I might want it slightly bigger so I can increase the size, and the choke will kind of variate the level of fall off to that shadow. make it fairly small. Okay, I don't want it too overpowering, and you'll find as well that these do end up looking fairly computer generated. All right, they're very equal throughout unless you spend the time now going back in and working over the top. We're not going to do that at the moment, but something to those settings. I might even just drop the opacity slightly on it, and if you wanted you could always add some noise. I'm going to keep that as it is and just hit OK. And if I wanted to, I can duplicate this layer and do exactly as we did. So using these couple of methods, what I want you to do is go through the panels, selecting individual ones and working on them. You can use either method or a combination of the two. Just be careful that you don't overdo it. It's very easy to end up getting carried away, and usually it's better to start off with less and add in. Okay, we don't want this looking computer generated. We want it looking as natural and as realistic as possible. Okay, so I'm going to again do a few more of these panels at a slightly higher speed just so you can watch and get an idea. I'm then going to stop it, and when we restart I'll have a finished wing that I've been working on. So this is the point that I reached having been working on the panels. You can see that still within the wing panel group that I've got all of my copies that contain the vector masks. You can see the inner shadows under the effects there. And it does take a bit of time. I did actually alter some of my original selection for panels because I ended up getting a collection up here and it just looked too organized in terms of the shadowing and the variating color. So with that done, as we're discussing panels at the minute, we may as well think of the rivets. And I'm going to use the reference image of the Mustang taking off to have a quick look. And this is fortunately quite a good photo, and you can clearly see the rivets, how it's connected. You can see that dependent on the panel size, there's different numbers of them, and they're all pretty equally spaced around. Now, to try and do all the paneling by hand, dot by dot, is going to take you a long time, and thankfully in Photoshop there's a few things that we can do to our brush. It's going to make this easier for us. First of all, I'm going to create a new layer, however, and I'm going to place it right at the top so it overlies everything, and I'm going to call this the rivet layer. And the brush that I'm going to begin with is going to be quite a small one. I'm going to work at 3 pixels as a master diameter. All right, it's using the brush that has the hardest edge to it. I've still got a very low flow on the brush, so I'm going to turn that right up to its maximum and just make a few adjustments to the brush itself. Now you can see here what I'm going to end up with. I'm going to turn off the shape dynamics on it, and within the brush tip shape, the only thing that I want to mess around in here is the spacing slider. So if I turn that up, you can see how it actually separates the brush stroke, and I end up getting some round dots, and then it's just a case of painting where we want the rivets. I'm going to zoom in. Let's begin on this panel as it's one of the smallest ones. Hit B as a shortcut for brush, and then just left click, and we can work through. Now it is fairly hard trying to remain accurate to the edge, but you will find, of course, that riveting wouldn't be 100% straight. Maybe the spacing that we have isn't far enough, but unfortunately that is the maximum level that we're able to achieve for the brush. Okay, so we'll probably have to come in and do some slight editing on it. It's going to go around, see across the base as well. It's definitely not straight, that one. Alright, so it's one of those times again, I'm just going to speed up the video just while I'm doing this. And what I want you to bear in mind, of course, is that I will be only doing half of this because I'm going to duplicate it across in a moment. So there are the rivets done, and as I said, to save a little bit of time, so there are the rivets, and just to save us a bit of time, as I said, what we're going to do is just duplicate this layer, so drag it down, we get our copy, and then go to edit, transform, and we're going to flip this in the horizontal. And just to ensure that we're on the move, hit V, and then if you hold down shift, it's going to lock the translations into either horizontal or vertical. And I'm just going to drag, and you can see there, just pulling the rivets across until they're in approximately the same position. Now obviously they're not going to be exact line up because everything's slightly different. Remember, this is based upon our UVs and our texture borders. So we might need to do a little adjustment, but I think as this is the underneath of the wing as well, the position there is going to be okay. All right. All right, next step. We've completed the rivets. We've got some shadowing around our panels, we've got variation. Got to start thinking about metal and how it gets scratched and dented, and this is where we can start to bring in some of the source images that I showed you earlier on. So there are the rivets, and just to save us a bit of time, as I said, what we're going to do is just duplicate this layer, so drag it down, we get our copy, and then go to edit, transform, and we're going to flip this in the horizontal. And just to ensure that we're on the move, hit V, and then if you hold down shift, it's going to lock the translations into either horizontal or vertical. And I'm just going to drag, and you can see there, just pulling the rivets across until they're in approximately the same position. Now obviously they're not going to be exact line up because everything's slightly different. Remember, this is based upon our UVs and our texture borders. So we might need to do a little adjustment, but I think as this is the underneath of the wing as well, the position there is going to be okay. Before we move on to the next part, I'm going to take the two layers that I have here for the rivets, just go to Layer, Merge Layers. Okay, and just going to rename this, obviously take off the copy. Okay, so we've already dealt slightly with the panels. We've got specific areas of variation in color, got some shadowing, we've got the rivets. Now we need to think about the whole surface overall. And using some of the source images that we had a look at earlier on, we're going to begin to put in some scratches, we're going to put in some dust, maybe a bit of dirt across the surface, okay? And the first image that we will use will be, just go into our source images here, texture reference. we are going to use the Scratches Bare Metal to begin with. You just open that up. As you can see, slightly different look to the metal than we're actually aiming for, but it's all of these scratches that I'm interested. And the easiest way of doing this to begin with, let's just drag it into our work document. And it's coming on top at the moment. Now I'm not too worried about that at the minute. What I do need to do, however, is just ensure that it's going to start blending in. So this layer I'm going to call the scratches layer. And we need to scale it in as well. So let's just Control T, so we get a free transform. Now, as I'm only concentrating on the wing at the moment, I'm just going to, doesn't matter that it's not going to cover the rest. Just got to bear in mind the whole idea about scale. We don't want scratches on the surface that just look too large and too unnatural. Okay, so maybe bring this in even further. Maybe to about that size. Now, I haven't placed it completely over because I'm going to begin to use the clone tool and actually start to work across and expand this. I can do this in a number of ways, of course. One way is to duplicate the layer, move this down, might even rotate it around just so we get a better match between these two. And apply that. So we're starting to build up the surface. And then if I hit Control E, it will merge that layer down onto my previous one. So they're now combined. And I need to work across the seam and just fill in these last areas. So let's go to the clone tool. Let's just increase the size of the brush a little bit. Select an area and just roughly work over. Now, doesn't matter if it's not 100% perfect, because eventually the way that we're going to blend this into the texture, it's only going to be fairly faint. Okay, so continue with this. Something like that. And we can use the clone as well just to finish off these outside areas, just to expand it. You make the brush even bigger. Just drop some of the flow on it. So I think that'll be suitable just like that. Now, as I said, it's completely overlaid, and that's what we want, because these scratches will be on top of the panels, and we want the scratches to also affect the rivet layer. And in that case, we need to switch from a normal to perhaps a hard light, soft light layer. So let's go in and just alter this. You can see if we darken the effect that we get. We're going to go through. Now the darker color is not too bad. I think with the overlay seems the most suitable for this. Again, it's kind of preference and what look you're trying to obtain from this. But that means that we retain the panels, Okay, we retain the inner shadows that we set in. We have the rivets, of course, and now we've got the scratches in the surface. Might need to bring the opacity down slightly so it doesn't stick out too much. And to begin with, that's looking fine. Now we're going to put in a few more layers similar to this. One thing that I've noticed, however, about the rivets, now they are small, but they look perfect. They look a little bit too solid, hard-edged for my liking. So I'm going to jump into the rivet layer quickly and just go to Filter, Blur, and to Gaussian Blur. Just adjust this slightly just to soften off the edges so they're not completely pinpoint. Okay, so continuing with what we've just done, let's think about maybe putting in another layer, perhaps not scratches this time, but maybe a slight layer of rust and a slight layer of dirt. To further distress this, we're going to think about the dirt and the dust that might collect on it. Just want to bear in mind, however, that the surface is actually looking fairly bright. Okay, we could, if we wanted to, take the panel detailing and just switch the layer, which will really darken this off. But that's slightly too extreme. What I may do though is take the wing panels group and just ever so slightly reduce the opacity to take the edge off of those bright panels that we have. Okay, so the first layer of dust, I'm going to go to File, Open, and use the Dust 000 that we have here. And obviously we're not going to want the blue in this. We're just going to want to take out this beige dust. It's actually got quite a nice area here. Maybe it's rust, maybe it's a bit of mud. Hopefully that will appear to be more rust-like when we take it into our work area. I am going to use the select color range, and what I'm looking for is just the beige, as I said. So let's pick quite a large dominant area of it, and I've got quite a high fuzziness on this to ensure that I can try and extract as much of that beige as possible. So if I have a look, see, it's pulling out some, but it's leaving the softer edges. So what I may wish to do, Control D to deselect that. And how about we zoom in a little bit closer so we can ensure that we're grabbing the correct color. Select that there. Okay, try that. Now, and that's a lot better. So it's just the original selection that I had. I'm going to run just a quick test to begin with. That's my file, obviously, that I'm working on. Copy and paste into our scene and see the sort of result that we're getting. Now, yes, it is bringing in some of the blue with it, but once we start to affect the blending options for this, I think we're going to be able to get away with having that. Now I'm going to drop it right at the top, okay, because I want the dust to be sitting over the scratches, although you may find the other way around might be better. Let's leave it at the top and we can come back to it once we've got the scale of this correct. All right, Control T to transform, and I'm going to start bringing this down to its better scale. I'm also going to turn it so it looks as if it's been created by maybe water or the dust washing over the wings, and position this in somewhere about there to begin with. Let's just go and see if it's the right size. I mean, it's going to look alright. It's still quite dominant at the minute because it's just working on a normal layer. So let's change the blending options for it. So if we start going through, we have normal, dissolve. Darken's not the correct way, so we're looking to have a lighter blending mode. Now the lighten itself is working pretty well. We haven't got any of that blue, but we're still getting some of that beige in there, so that's a potential option. The screen's a bit too overpowering. Now the overlay's pretty good, but again, you see we're kind of being hampered by the blue. We could always change the opacity, but then we're going to lose the dust as well. Although the soft light, again, I think overall what's going to give us the best solution to this is going to be the lighten. Okay, we can always work with this and we can come back in and place another layer over the top if it's still not looking predominant enough. But again, I've only got a section of this. Now this is up to you how you want to do it. You can copy and paste if you wanted to. So I'm going to right click on the layer and go to select pixels and then copy paste. And I've now got myself a new layer with some dust on it. So let's just organize this. All right. This is on the top, of course. What we might want to do is just Control E to merge those two layers and then duplicate this one. Going to use a translate and rotate it 180 degrees round so that if you imagine that this edge here is going to line up with this edge, we can see if we can get some pattern of dust or the movement of the dust across the wing lining up. I might even flip that in the vertical. So edit, transform, flip in vertical, okay, to move it round, and then I've got the opportunity to try and line up these areas, right? I think that's not too bad as the first kind of dust layer goes. Let's just drop some of the opacity on that. Of course, be aware it looks a lot stronger because it's above the black surface here. But if we take it off and we've got some of the grey beneath it, you can see it's going to work okay. May want to just tidy it up perhaps by using a clone just to maybe smear across where we connected the two pieces together right at the start. But I think we can leave it at that and just look at perhaps adding a touch more to change the surface quality across the panels again. A very fast way just to add a touch of varying surface quality is to use one of the images in here called the galvanized metal. If we open that up, you'll notice that it's not 100% in what we're going for, but the combination of that and everything that we've done so far will help to just break up this surface even more. So I'm just going to drag and drop it into our work area and let's scale this down to about 50% to begin with and see if that's going to be all right. Just looking, obviously this isn't going to be the correct proportions, but as long as it covers the entire wing, should be all right. So let's just scale that up. And with that there, I can begin to go through the options available, again, using the blending options and opacity to get it to fit. Now, because we don't want to darken it, of course, anything with the darken color, multiply color, burn isn't really going to help us. So I'll probably look more at maybe an overlay or perhaps a soft light to get it sitting in there, and you can see how it now sits. Okay, it's a little bit too intense, so I'm going to drop the opacity on it, and I'm also going to stick it beneath the scratched layer as well, so that the scratches are on top and therefore working into this layer. So if I turn it off, you can see the difference between having it on or turning it off. Okay, so just to about there, and don't forget to label this up quite easily. I'm just going to call it galvanized and leave it as that. Right, so it's getting better. We just need to now have a think about the panels again, and these are supposed to be separate from each other. And at the minute we've kind of been working across the whole surface. Now, based upon some of the source images that I have, if I go and look at the panel seams here, in between the seams we're going to end up developing rust areas. Okay, it's not going to be all the way down or all the way across, so we're going to have to think of the best ways in which we do this. Now I'm going to show you a couple of ways within the next chapter that is either very manual using painting, or just by bringing in photos of rust, cutting and applying them. Now the first way of creating rust that we're going to do is to use just a paintbrush and paint it in our cells. Now we've got the panel detailing here that we can use to help select the areas we want to paint. I'm going to use the magic wand using the same settings as before, and ensuring I'm on the right layer, just go around adding all the panels into the selection. Like so. And while we're doing this, it's quite good to point out the save selection option within Photoshop. So if we go to select save selection, I'm going to call this the panel rust selection and hit OK. Now what I've done is I've saved that, so if I deselect it, or I want to return to that selection for any point or at any point throughout the rest of the tutorial, I can go select, load selection, and find my panel rust selection there. Hit OK, and I get it back. Now if I begin to paint, what I need first of all is a new layer. I need a brush, and I'm just going to use a standard round brush for this and increase the size of it quite a bit because it's only going to be rough painting. And the color is going to be a rusty orange color to begin with. Something like that will be okay. And if we start to paint, you'll notice that it's not painting in the areas that we want. All right, so let's just undo that. And this time it's just Control Shift and I before we paint, which is going to give us an inverted selection. Problem is if you now look at the selection, there's hardly anything to paint there anyway. So let's undo that. Go to the magic wand and use this refine edge. Now the benefit of the refined edge means we can adjust how the selection is. What I'm going to use is settings of 0, so drop that down, and I'm also going to adjust the contract and expand, bring that down to about 40. So we're kind of reducing the selection of the panel and increasing the area of the connection lines or the separation lines. Okay, hit OK, and then we're going to Control Shift and I, and we've got more area now to paint into around the joints. So with the brush on the correct layer, let's just begin to work in. I'm not worried that I'm going slightly over the edge here. Obviously, if I went too far, I might end up painting onto the other wing, but I can always come in and rub that out if I am. So I just paint it over very roughly, and then Control D to deselect, and you can see that we've got a very rough and uniform rust painted in. Now the thing is I'm going to leave this above the panel detailing at the moment, because even though we have the separation lines, as I mentioned right at the start, we're not going to have those black lines in there anyway in the final color map. So we can shove that over the top, and I'm also going to blur this slightly because it's very hard edged and rust just isn't like that. So let's go to filter, ensuring that we're on the right layer, blur, Gaussian blur, and okay, we don't want to be excessive like so, but we drop it maybe back down to about 2.4. I'll start to soften it off slightly, and then we can come back in on top and start to paint certain areas of this out. I'm going to use a vector mask for this, as we did before when we were doing the panels. Just apply it in by hitting that button. I'm going to pick a brush. Okay, I'm on the black color. Now this brush that I'm going to use, perhaps let's try something like this one. Okay, and I'm just going to ensure that we have some spacing in between. I can start to go in and just roughly paint areas out. You may want to reduce the flow as well, just so you can gradually work areas away rather than suddenly getting rid of it. So I am just being pretty rough with this and not too worried about it, because on top I'm actually going to bring in some images as well that we can add in. Okay. It's looking a little bit bright, that rust, so let's just go into the image adjustments, and what I'll do is go into the curves, stick a point in the center there, and we'll just start to darken it off. Just ever so slightly, like that, so it's looking better. And now we can move on to the next part of adding rust, which is, as I say, taking an image and bringing it in. Now we've added rust very, very basically in a form of just a block color. We now want to work in on top of that by using an image such as this. All right, now at the moment it's not exactly what we want because it's got a central section, whereas the way the panels meet on the aircraft is literally to have a section of color right next to a section of color. So I'm going to bring that in just by left click, dragging across, and if we zoom out, what I'm going to do is just reduce the scale of that to begin with straight away, and then we can start to edit it. Now of course we don't want this section, and the easiest way to get around that would be to cut the interior area out. We could do that and just hit delete, and then of course we would need to take the bottom area, and then of course we could right click in the selection and layer via cut, so they're on different layers now, and we can just move it up and attach it in. So that should be okay just to begin with. Control E to merge the layers together to bring it back into one piece, and then we can begin to work and overlay it into the rust. So it will need to be scaled quite a bit, and obviously its position within the layers will need to be adjusted. So I'm going to take that and bring it above, let's place it just above the wing panels. All right, we'll worry about the blue coloring in a moment. I just want to get this into a rough area to begin with. So if we place it in, something about like that, be okay. And then we can duplicate more of these off, right, for certain areas. If you wanted to take more time, you can go and find more image so you have a variation of rust in your scene. Just gonna squeeze that down slightly so it's not too overpowering. And then let's go and take a look at the blend options and which would be most suitable. So we've got normal, of course, dissolve. Now the darken's pretty good straight away. There's a few areas that may need to be cleaned up because they just look unusual, but the rest of the section's looking alright. And I think if we stay with the darken, can then go in and modify this slightly. It looks just too black at the minute in there. So I'm just going to realign it to begin with. Right, get it so it's actually down this connection line. And then we can go in with a rubber and just rub away the areas that we don't want. And having done that, let's go to image adjustments, brightness contrast. I'm just going to adjust the brightness of it. Okay. Now maybe that black's still too dark. What we can do is a replace color. So image adjustments, replace color. And I'm going to take this black area here and change it to a bit more of a lighter color. Right, so that'll do for the minute. Obviously, when we come around to placing it onto the aircraft in Mara as well, we may find that it's too strong still. But in fact, reducing the opacity on it's helping that out as well. So if you want to now go around, I'm going to just take this layer, copy it, and to get another area of rust, and I'm going to start working with this so I can bring it across to here, scale it in. Got to be careful because there is some certain amount of repetition, of course, if we just keep on deleting it all the time. So if you can go onto the internet and select some more images of rust that we can use for this. Now you can see there that I've added in additional areas of rust, and there they are within the layers. What I'm going to do is just take all of these and combine them. So select them all and then use Control E. And that will give us all of the rust, but you can see how the blending options have switched back to normal. So we need to, of course, put this back to darken. So go in third option down, and there you go, it's now at 1. So we've got an overall control over this rust layer if we want. One thing that I'm still not 100% happy with is this orange layer that we painted in. Now, yes, it's above the panel detailing, but if I bring it above the wing panels, you can see how much there is of it there, and it's just quite overpowering. But this seeping that it gets over the edge of the panels is definitely what I'm looking for. So I'm going to reduce that down, reduce the opacity. Okay, because what was happening before, because it was sitting under the wing panels, they were acting as a mask for it, so we couldn't entirely see the whole rust and the blur that I placed onto it. Now it's actually spilling out over the top, and it's starting to work in really nice with the images of rust as well. But having done that, we've got that certain level of it that's just too much. It's now just looking too over the top. So I'm going to work back in again as we did before, using the vector mask with a black paintbrush. Okay, now we're not going to want any of the edges down here orange, i.e. with rust on it, because these connect to each other, these two edges, and there shouldn't be a visible seam there. Alright, so we'll work through on that. You can see what the brush is actually doing by the larger amount of orange, or the overhang of orange that there is. Okay, maybe just break up some of this. I go and just change the brush. Use something a little bit more harder going. So if this aircraft had been flying during the war, perhaps we might have some damage, perhaps a few bullet holes. So in this section, we're going to take the bullet hole texture, just open that up. Now this is an image that was created inside Photoshop. And we're going to separate this inner section where we have the rust and the hole from the white background before we take it into our main texture. I'm going to use the magic wand, and I'm going to just ensure that the tolerance level is fairly high. That way I can guarantee that I'm going to get a selection right up to the more harder edges. Okay, it's going to ignore these paled colored areas, and that's what I want. I don't really want any additional surrounding to it. I want a hard edge, because if this is metal that's been chipped by the bullet going through, it wouldn't be soft and blended out. Okay. Having selected that, I need to Control Shift and I to invert the selection, Control and C to copy, and then Control and V to paste it into my layer. Now at the moment it's sitting beneath all the dust and scratches. What I may do is bring this up just beneath the dust. In fact, let's put this right on top. Say it's a new piece of damage to the surface. And before I start to scale it in, I'm going to look at some of the layer styles to get this actually sitting correctly. It looks good, but the problem is the area between the rust here and the upper panel surface doesn't look right. It looks very flat, whereas there'd be some sort of three-dimensional feel to this. So if I just move this slightly to the left and then double click on the layer, I'm going to bring up the layer styles. Now in the inner shadow, what I'm going to do is drop the distance so I get an overall shadow on the inside, and just begin to work with the choke and the size just to start getting a little bit of darkness around here. Now I'm not going to force it too much, okay, but I'm also going to turn on the bevel and emboss, which will add a greater sense of three-dimensionality to this image. It's very important we get the style right. The inner bevel isn't correct. It just looks very straight, as if it's kind of been cut. What I'm looking for is the outer bevel. Alright, and I'm going to use the chisel soft and work with the size and the soften, perhaps even a bit of depth to it. Okay, so when you've reached a point where you're happy with, you can click OK, and I can now start to just scale this down so it fits. Do remember, of course, that this is not the full wing size. This is the UV map unwrapped, so the wing is actually split here. The top surface is from here to the center. And it's very easy just to get the scale looking wrong if you don't remember that. I'm going to bring them down perhaps to, let's have a look, I've just given it an uneven dimension there. So keep shift held down as you are scaling it. And so we'll place the first one there. Slightly too big. Do remember, of course, that we're going to have decals or transfers. Now it's quite nice to combine everything together and have a bullet going through the decal. So I'm going to turn those on, and they are down at the bottom here. And just ensure that I've got the left wing and the wing stripe. I can't see anything at the minute because this group is right at the base. I'm going to bring it up, just drop it beneath the bullet. Okay, so I can now work with this and say, well, I'm going to place one there, duplicate that layer, move this out to about here, can duplicate that layer. I'm going to put one definitely there, kind of crossing into the transfer. Another one perhaps there. It's quite hard laying these in. When you try to lay objects in as random, they can end up looking fairly organized. So you might need to just take a bit of time rearranging them till you get something that you like. Maybe something that'll do for the moment. That does the job. It looks fairly random, and I'm making sure, of course, that I'm getting this one into the transfer. Let's turn the decals off now and take all of the bullet layers, those there, just drag them into a new group, and I'm going to call that new group the bullet hole group. Okay, with that done, do bear in mind that if a bullet enters metal, you might get some scorching, some burning around the edges. You might even get some black dust, around the bullet hole. So if you want to, you can add in all this additional detail. Go and have a look for reference images, maybe of bullets that have gone into car windows, car doors, and see what that actually causes. Are there any marks? Does it leave a black powder around the edge from the heat? So we're really kind of at a point now where the colouring on the wing is done. It's probably just about making a few more adjustments, maybe going in and having a look at a few areas. What I will do is just to create a new layer that, again, I'm going to place under the bullet hole group, right? And what this is just going to be a darkening layer. I'm still a little bit unsure about how light this is. It's one of those things, I can keep this in and I can always have it there to darken or lighten the whole texture if need be. Just got to bear in mind that once I see it within Maya and when we actually render it out, then I may have to come back in and actually readjust the texture based upon the lighting of the scene. So what I'm going to do in my new layer is just go to filter, and under render I'm going to use clouds, and that will create this. Now of course the blending option is incorrect, so let's just change that. And one of the best ones for this is going to be the darken. Now of course that's a way too dark for it, so we have the opacity to bring that down. Right, again, it's not much, but there's something extra there over the surface. You can even go a little bit further and go to filter, render and difference clouds, which will add even more into it. And perhaps that's even better. It's not as patchy as the last one, so just bring that down. And I might even want to bring in an overall rust color to this. I'm going to select the original rust layer that we were working on. What I need to do is find out the color that was. So what I'm going to do is duplicate it, and then I'm going to drag this up to the top just to ensure that the color that I see will be the exact color that I require. Take off the opacity, and that there is the original orange that I used to paint it with. And having done that, get rid of the layer there. I'm going to come back down next to the painted rust. I'm just going to put a new layer above it and edit fill, and fill with the foreground color that I want. There it is, hit OK, and I now have a nice large area of orange. It's not correct in terms of the blending options. We just need to tweak that. And if we go into the drop down, I think perhaps maybe a soft light, drop that in, and then really just strip away the intensity just with the opacity there. Of course, using the block color, as I've mentioned, isn't the best way because it is so uniform. But if you do spend the time to work in or combine it with actual real images, as we've been doing, you'll find that it will break it up. But there's no reason, again, why you couldn't look on the internet and find large shots of rust that you can then just overlay behind it. So that's the main wing done. What we can do is just save this out. And having done that, we can move on to the next step, which is to begin to look at the decals themselves and how we're going to distress those so they fit in with our wing. So as you can see, the texture that we've got for the wing is pretty much near done. We're going to have to come back in and tweak it, perhaps dependent upon the scene that we're going to be working in Maya. But our next problem is the decals and how we're going to get those to look as if they're part of this wing as well. At present, because they're so perfect, it really is obvious that they're just stuck onto this wing. We need to incorporate these scratches and the dirt on top of these as well. But because these aren't metal, they're going to have worn away differently. They're going to have a different look to them. So we're going to do this gradually over a number of steps. I'm going to go through how we can use textures again to help us very quickly make these look as if they're old and worn out. Before I do anything, what I'm going to do is take a duplication of this layer of the left wing decal, just drag that down in to make a copy, and then remove that copy layer from the group. Now the reason why I'm doing this is so that if I make a mistake or end up in a position where I don't like the effect that I've applied to it, I can always resort back to the original and start again. Let's turn off the original decal group, and first things first, I'm going to take the copy and actually bring it down underneath the darken layer and the dust layer so that it already begins to look as if the decal was placed on before all the dirt and the dust. Now we're going to start getting more intricate and start to make this look as if it's peeling off. So I've got a couple of images that we're going to use for this. We've got the cracks 00 and cracks 01. I'm going to start with the 00 first of all. So if you just open that up, and you'll see that it's paint that's obviously dried, it's old, and it's starting to peel off of the surface it's painted on. I think it's just a wall of some sort. And it's this detail that we're going to use to actually take away information from our decal. We'll begin by dragging this into our work area. Hit Control T so we get a free transform, and I'm going to scale this to about 15%, okay, width and height, and start to place it over the decals. Now I'm going to rotate this, bring it round. Now I'm not too worried if it doesn't cover the whole texture. Might be better if it does, to prevent any obvious straight lines when we're working on it. Something like that will be okay. And then drag that layer to copy it so I can place it over the other decal. I might want to just rotate this, or you can flip it, or any way of making it slightly different to this one. And then we'll Control E. If we have a look, remember that merges the selected layer down onto the layer beneath it. So if we move it, they both now move together. So we need to select areas that we will want to remove from the decal. I'm going to create a vector mask first of all on the left wing decal copy layer. Go back into this layer that contains the textures we've just brought in, right click, select pixels, because we're going to use the color range and we only want to select color from these areas. We don't want to take it from the paneling or anything like that. So let's go select color range and just select the darkest color. Now I might even just cancel that and move in slightly just so I get a better selection. Color range, and I'm going to have quite a high fuzziness to ensure that I get these fairly faint lines in. Right, so that's exactly what I'm looking for. It'll be perfect. And now I can hide that layer and select the vector mask on the wing decal copy. Now we used a similar sort of method when we were working on some of the panels. I'm going to take a brush and use a brush that's going to give me a fairly broken finish, so maybe like a splatter of some sort. I'm going to reduce the opacity and the flow quite low to begin with. I can always bring it up and make it stronger later on. I'm going to start quite softly and obviously ensuring that it's black. I'm just going to start brushing in certain areas, okay, just very faintly to begin with, and it doesn't have to be all over, okay, because it obviously going to have various areas that might have peeled away more or got older quicker than others. Now if we Control D, you can see I'm starting to take out areas. To make it obvious as to what you're doing, you could always remove the dust layer, and you can see there that is what we've done so far. Alright, so in the history, let's just step back so we still have the selection and keep on working into it. Remember, all the time just brushing ever so gently in certain areas. If you want to, of course, you might want to turn the opacity up and work slightly harder into different areas, because then we're going to start building up this variating surface. Okay, so that's pretty good. I probably don't want to go any more than that to begin with. Okay, so with that done, what I'm going to do is now think about the panels themselves that sit underneath. If these are stickers, or even if they're painted on these decals, we're going to have some kind of line, And you can even see here that it's starting to show through where I've worn away some of the decal already. I'm just going to emphasize that slightly. Now we can use, of course, our selection that we made earlier on to create the rusting. Remember, Control Shift and I to invert the selection. And using the same brush, maybe on a lower opacity again, ensure I'm working in the vector mask. Let's just brush over these areas. Okay, so I'm starting to bring those through now as if it's wearing away. Now we're still not finished. I've got another image that I'm going to use, which is the cracks_01. And this has got the slightly larger cracks within it. And it's also got these straight lines. Now the straight lines themselves at the moment don't look as if they're going to be particularly useful, but when we come to working into it, you'll see the additional effect that they give. I'm going to again just Control T and bring these down to, I don't know, this time maybe sort of say 20% as we had to scale beforehand. And I'm going to position these so that I'm going to be getting the black line across some area. Let's just Control T to place this at an angle like that. And then we're going to duplicate this layer, bring it down, Control T again, place it at an angle. Alright, duplicate that, bring it across because we can't forget this decal on this side. Control T, choose another angle, and again duplicate that. Control T, and place it at an angle. Now I'm going to merge all of those four together just fairly quickly using the Control E. So they're now as one. And again, select the pixels. Right, zoom in, and I'm going to select color range and this dark color. Now I might want to reduce the fuzziness now because I'm only wanting the very hard black areas. That should be okay. Let's hide the layer, select the vector mask again, and once again using the same brush, let's just begin to work over some of these larger cracks. Now I'm definitely going to ensure that I'm using the straight lines. Okay, now the benefit of these straight lines is they're going to give us really nice looking scratches, okay, that actually run right through the decal. Control D, so you can see them there just starting to appear in. What I might want to do is just turn this opacity right up on the brush just while I do these scratches here. Alright, and then of course, even though we've been using textures, we can come in and begin to break up the edge of the surface ourselves by just using various different brushes. Okay, just working very gently in. And another good texture we can use is if we go File, Open, using the Scratches one. It's fairly, perhaps a little too much in terms of what we're aiming for, but again it's got these very dark, very heavy areas of scratching. It's going to make it very easy for us to break up the edge of our texture. So Control T, let's make it smaller, 230. Okay, and I'm going to align this so that obviously the scratches are running this direction through it. And let's just reduce the opacity so I can see underneath. Think about there, I'm going to try and wear out more of this front area. and duplicate that. Control T, rotate it round, alright, so that the scratches are going to match with regards to the underneath decal. And it's just the same process again. Merge it down, select the pixels, and then again select the color range. Even lower fuzziness this time, or perhaps a little bit more than that. Okay, be careful, I've actually deselected the pixels there. So I would have ended up actually selecting some of the colors that were in the original texture for the wing. Let's bring that up to about 80. Okay, that's going to be better. Now you can do this with not just scratch texture reference images, you can a number of things. You might even find that paper works quite well, in dirt, ground textures, anything. That's you're not limited in Photoshop, and that's the nice thing. As long as you end up getting the final look that you're aiming for, you can use whatever. It's so versatile, and it really gives you the opportunity to try out quite a few different methods of getting the look. So I'm now using another texture, as I say, to just break up the edge, but I could quite easily come in and just use a different brush to start breaking up this nice perfect decal. Alright, so he's starting to wear that bit away. Maybe work a little bit harder. Okay, like so. Maybe might have overdone it slightly there, but I'm fairly happy with that. Now, of course, don't forget we've also got the stripe that's supposed to be on the wing. If we turn on our original decals again, can turn off the left wing, but we have the wing stripe. So this is going to be exactly the same process. We're going to duplicate this and we're going to start working into it, just using the same techniques that I've done there. You could even look into perhaps changing some of the levels, going into the adjustment mode, and perhaps changing contrast. Even maybe start looking at some of these filters and seeing what effect that can give you. I'm going to save this off now, and when we come back we're going to take this image out and place it onto our aircraft within Maya just to see what it looks like, and then begin to start discussing creating a bump map and a specular map from what we already have. Now, before we save this out as a texture to use in Maya, there's a couple of things that I'm going to do. I pointed out right at the start of the video that the panel detailing layer will be used as a reference as to where to place each individual panel, where the rust is going to be. But the dark border edges that we can see won't be needed to indicate separate panels, because what we're going to have instead is shadows caused by a bump map. Now, if I remove that layer, it doesn't look as if anything's happening to the color of the texture, but I'm just going to cover my back by creating a new layer and going to the color picker. I'm going to ensure that I'm using a 50% grey. That's the original grey that was on the panel detailing layer. I have either 50, 0, 50 in the HSB or 128, 128, 128. Either of those values will give you the same mid grey. Hit OK and then edit and fill, foreground color, and that will just ensure that I'm keeping any grey that may be affecting or adding a depth into this texture. Right, let's just ensure that that's off and our new layer is on. I'm going to save that. File, save, directly, just so it saves into the PSD. And you can see that it's starting to take a while to save just due to all the information. Now if I was to export this directly as a texture, the renders in Maya are going to be horrendously slow. Alright, and we can get around that by going to File, Save As, and saving it as a TIFF. But even then, it's going to retain all of this layer information. So I have to just layer, flatten image, and discard any hidden layers that I have. And you'll notice that all I've got is one layer now that comprises everything that I've done so far all together. It's File, Save As, and go to the textures, and I'm going to call this the Mustang color _09, so that there is a relationship between the texture and the Photoshop file. Use the TIFF format and have no image compression, and hit OK. Right, with that done, we can close down Photoshop and go and open up Maya to apply the texture. So when you're back in Maya, we're going to be in the Mustang distressing _00 file, the start file for the tutorial. I'm going to select it, right click, and assign a new blin. Now I'm going to start with the blin because this is now going to have the ability to have specular highlights in it, whereas the Lambert doesn't. Now some of this aircraft, even though it's old, will still be shiny. I mentioned that we will come on to doing a specular map later on. I'm just going to worry some at the minute about the color. So let's just select the color flag and we'll map a normal 2D texture to it. And that texture will of course be the Mustang color _09. And if we take a render of that, you can see we have a wing that has specular highlights on it and our nice texture. Thing is, the texture looks a little bit soft, and that's due to this filter type. I'm going to turn that off and take a new render. You can see the difference between the two. Right? Now, because we're creating a still image, we're going to leave the filter type off, although sometimes when you're doing an image sequence you may find the texture will flicker, and therefore the filter will come in handy, as that will help remove it. That's all very good like that. I just want to get an idea of the shadows that are going to be in there by using a bump map, or at least the additional definition that I will have across the wing. So what I've done is I've saved out a copy of the panel detailing, which was the plain grey image that we had with the black lines. And I'm going to put that into the bump map, okay, again as a normal 2D texture, and I've called this the Mustang Bump Basic, just for the moment, just so I know that later on down the line that was just the test. Again, I'm going to take the filter off and we'll render it, and it's going to be a bit over the top. Alright, it's because we haven't changed the level, but you can see what effect this is going to have. Let's take this right down to about 0.05 and re-render that. So the difference between this one here and this one here isn't too much, but the subtlety of the bump does make a difference, and when we start to put lights in here as well, you will see that even more because of shadows. So I'm happy with that texture on the aircraft. The bullet holes are the right size, the decals are looking nice. So what I'm going to do is go back into Photoshop and actually create a specific bump map for the color texture that I've got. Because the thing is the basic one just deals with the panels. We haven't got any of the bullet holes incorporated into it. We haven't got any maybe slight dents within the surface. So we're going to use the color map and from that extract a bump map within the next chapter. So before I go any further with creating the bump map, I'm going to take the color file that we were last working in and immediately save this as Mustang bullet bump underscore 01. Now the reason I've specifically named this as bullet bump is because I'm going to separate my bump maps. I'm going to have a number of them that I'll eventually combine when we're working within Maya. The benefit of this is that I can affect the bump depth for the bullet holes and not affect either the rivets or the panel detailing bump. This means that I can fine tune more and get an accurate relationship between the two. So if we're just concentrating on the bullet holes within this map, first things first, I need to get rid of everything I no longer need. So the original decals, all of the dust layers, all of the darken layers, all of the scratch layers, the metal, the rust. Okay, I'm going to get rid of everything apart from the bullet holes and this grey fill layer that I created just before taking the color map and saving it out as a TIFF. And let's get rid of those. And I'm going to get rid of the panel detailing, of course, and the paint layer. And this is what I'm left with. Doesn't look like a lot, but it is specific for the 5 or 6 bullet holes that we have. I'm going to begin working on this one first, and we'll be using the black and white. The reason why I'm choosing a specific layer is if you select the whole group, you're not able to adjust the group, and you can't adjust multiple layers at one time. So with that selected, let's just, okay, we're going to be working on this one here, right down at the bottom. Zoom in a touch, and it's now a case of just adjustments, black and white, and we've got the preview on here. So we're going to need to think, right, if obviously the hole is going to be right through the metal, and therefore we need that black. We may need to just start tweaking some of these areas. How far or how much of a difference do we want between the surface of the metal and the underlying metal that's slowly rusting away? We can really define that by using this red slider. You may have to just try each slider out just to see what effect you get. It's the red that's having the most results, so let's just, I'm going to keep it about that. You can see that we've got the darker areas here underneath the paint. Perhaps I won't really want them, but that will do to begin with. Of course, you can always use other adjustment modes as well to ensure that you get the definition that you're looking for. Let's move on to the next layer, and again I'm just going to quickly go through this now and just work. That's not related to that bullet hole. There it is, that's the one that we want. Okay, if there's a slight variation between the two, it's not going to matter. Remember, every hole is going to be slightly different. So let's move on. Okay, this one now. So I'm going through these quite quickly. Do spend time doing this. So I say there's plenty of ways of adjusting this, not just by using the black and white. It's quite a good place to start, but you can take the brightness and contrast, or even look at the levels before you even begin to adjust this as a black and white. Let's just put that in. Something like so. Right, so that's fairly quick, just creating the bump map for the bullet holes. What I'm going to do is file and save the PSD, and of course we need to file save as a TIFF to take it out. Remember as well though, if we are going to be doing that, let's just flatten the image. So layer, flatten image, to try and keep the file size to the smallest possible, and then save as into the textures area Mustang bullet bump underscore 01. There's the file relation. Into TIFF, save, none. So that's the bullet hole done. What we're going to do next is take a look at creating the bump map for the panels and the rivets. Just as before when I created the bump map for the bullet holes, what I'm going to do is take the original color file we were working in and file, save as, and this I'm going to call my Mustang panel bump underscore 01, and begin to remove all of the unnecessary layers. Now first of all, I'm not going to need the wing panels. Despite wanting to ensure that I get a bump where they're separated, the wing panels themselves have a variation in color, and created into a bump map, this will actually offset the panels from each other, which I don't want. I just want a bump in between the two, so let's get rid of that. The block rust I don't need. The painted rust could be quite useful, but the thing is it's far too blurred, and the bump, the width of the seam therefore will be too large and just look unnatural. So let's get rid of that layer. The interseam rust I will keep. The rivet layer, of course, I will keep. Galvanized, scratches, wing decal. Just talking about the scratches and galvanized, if you were going to have a very close up shot on the aircraft, you may want to do a fine detail bump. As we're still unsure about the final shot, let's leave it, as it's not really necessary, and should we choose at the end to have a very close up shot, we can always come in and create a new bump. So let's take these and delete those off. I'm going to delete off the unused layers that we used to create the distressing on the decals. The dust layer, the wing stripe copy, dust layer, darken layer, right, the original decals. I've just deselected everything, which is a little annoying. So I'm going to have to just go back in and quickly drag and delete those off. Don't need the bullet holes, of course. So all I'm left with is the rivet layer, the interseam, my layer 61 and my panel detailing. Now I mentioned that the panel detailing wouldn't be used for the color. However, it's perfect to create the bump map from. The only thing is it's got quite a hard edge to this. So we may need to apply a slight filter before we take it in. But let's try it how it is first of all. I'm going to get rid of that just to clear it up, and this layer here. Alright, so I could go through each one and individually convert them to black and white. Just to save a little bit of time, I'm going to flatten the image, discard any hidden layers, and then go to the image adjustments, black and white. Alright, so we can start working in. You can see that variating these will increase the size of the rust bump. Okay, I don't want it too much. Prefer a little bit of the color to come out further than the actual bump, because that's the way rust is. You'll always get areas of rust that are lighter, that haven't yet started to wear through the metal and create the holes. So if I can reduce the size of it, it's going to be beneficial. Let's try something like that. I've got a slight bit of white here creeping in. That's alright, because bump isn't just going to be into a surface. Especially with rust, you might find it actually ends up boiling up and actually sitting higher than the original panel itself. So let's just hit OK and see what this looks like as a bump map in Maya. Before we do that, just save, of course, to keep the work that we've done. And then file, save as, into the textures, and we'll call this the Mustang panel bump underscore 1 as a TIFF, save, none in terms of compression. And we can go back into Maya and now try out the bump and the color together. Let's begin by selecting the plane and applying a new material. We're going to use a blend, and in the bump mapping I'm going to use a 2D file, and that file of course is going to be the Mustang panel bump just for the moment. If I zoom in and hit render, you can see that as we haven't adjusted any of the settings, we are getting a bump in there, but it's just too much at the moment. The bump depth's too high. We're also getting a slightly jagged look to the edges. Now I've mentioned that perhaps this might occur. Let's leave that for the moment, and we can always come back to it later on if there's going to be a problem. So that's one of the bump maps in, but how do I bring in the secondary bump map? Well, within the hypershade, the blend, I'm going to graph the input and output connections, so you can see there the blend with the bump node and the file. But I'm going to physically create a 2D bump node, and I'm also going to create a new file node here. Now that file node will just middle mouse drop into the new bump 2D in the default. And that bump 2D, rather than going into the blend, I'm going to middle mouse drop it into the additional bump node, the first one that we created with the panel detail. And in the other, so the connection editor, I want to ensure that I connect the out normal to the normal camera. If you don't have all of the options, you may need to go to right display and show hidden. But with that done, you can see they are now all connected, and this file just needs to have the Mustang bullet bump applied to it. So now if I render, let's just bring this back. If I render this off, I should have a combination of, as you can see, the panel bump and also the bullet bump. And this is how we're going to begin to variate the depth, because I want more of a bump, I think, for the bullet holes than the panel detailing itself. But before I even do that, I want to place the color on, because the color will hide some of the discrepancies in the bump. So I may need to make further adjustments, I might not. So just map the color with, of course, the Mustang color _09. And there it is. Bring back the render view, save that image, and just take a new render with the bump and the color on. And you can see, of course, that yes, the bump is still too high, but we'll begin to start removing that now. And I'm going to do it with IPR setup. So just click IPR, select a region. I'm going to take this area here, window, rendering editors, and the hypershade, because I want to have access to the bump nodes here. And the first one, of course, is the panel detailing. So I'll select that, put the render view over here, and start to bring down the bump depth. And I think if I start around 0.05 perhaps, see what that gives me. Not too bad, maybe just a touch more, 0.07. Okay. And now what I can do is select the other bump node in the hypershade that's obviously related to the bullet holes and begin with the bump depth on that. Now, of course, these are going to be slightly heavier, so I might start with 0.07 and maybe a touch more. I've got quite a similarity between the two here, like where I have the rust and where the bullet hole is, so perhaps I might want to make it deeper. something like that, and reduce just slightly the paneling. Okay, if worst comes to the worst, if I still don't like the level of this rusted area in comparison to the bullet, I could always create a new bump and separate the two out again. The rivets are looking alright at that depth. So now that we've got something that we're fairly happy with in terms of the colour and the bump, we can move on to the specular map. As a point of interest, despite me mentioning before about the problems that we may have with the edge of the bump, once we've changed the levels, it seems to be alright. The only thing that I will do perhaps is to take the filter off of the colour that's been mapped to the blin. So just remove that, just to get something that's slightly more harder and a bit more dominant across the wing. So for the specular, as we did with the bump, I'm going to take the original color texture that we've created and save this as Mustang spec _01. And I'm immediately going to turn this to grayscale. All right, this will allow me to drop all of the color information. I don't want to merge when I do it, but there you see I can discard all the color information. We're going to approach this slightly differently to how we did the bump, because it's going to be more complex trying to get the results that we need from these layers. What I'm going to do is begin by just turning off all of the layers, and we're going to go through each one and actually see what needs to be worked on and why. I'm going to leave layer 61 on just so it gives us a background, and just go through the layers very quickly, turning each one off. Now layer 58 and 60 I can get rid of because they were part of the distressing for the decals, same as layer 59. I can just drop that off. Okay, just go all the way through, like so. Let's get rid of the original decal. And I'm going to get rid of the paint layer, as that's not part of this area on the plane. So the panel detailing sits beneath layer 61. That's not going to be a problem as layer 61 overrides it. Let's have a look at wing panels. Now, obviously, the lighter the area, the more specular the surface will be. This isn't too bad to begin with. I'm going to leave it as it is. It's going to act as a base layer. We can see that towards the edges, where it's starting to rust, we're losing the specularity. It's becoming more matte, the surface, whereas some panels are retaining it. So let's leave that one as it is. Okay. The block rust isn't going to have any effect, so I'm going to leave that off and just turn on the painted rust. Now this is very faint, as you can possibly see. What I'm going to do, I'm going to turn this up just so you can see it, and this is the incorrect way around. What we want is for the rust here to actually be a dark color. We can go to the image adjustments, brightness and contrast, and just pull all the brightness out. So what we're going to be left with are these dark areas that we're losing specularity in. So they're going to be matte, which is where the rust is, which is fine. We're going to have some speckles in there, which is good. Obviously, you can make sure that you're getting the correct look, but if we start with something like that, it's going to be fine. Remember, we're going to continually keep on changing these, especially when we come to lighting this aircraft correctly. We may need to alter the specular map, the bump map completely so as to suit the scene. Let's get rid of that. We've got the interseam rust, and that itself has converted quite nicely. I'm going to leave it as it is because it's all dark, and because that's such an intense area of rust, I think that there wouldn't be much specularity within it. The rivet layer is obviously the wrong way round. This again is going to need to be switched so that we may want a touch of highlighting around the edge. Now it's up to you if you want to do this. What we can do is leave it for the moment and just not include it in the specularity map for the minute. Just remember that the painted rust should actually have a lower opacity. Remember, I turned that up just so that you were able to see it. The galvanized layer, because this is random, again I'm going to leave it as it is, although I'm going to adjust it slightly so it isn't so specular, or isn't so bright. So drop that down. Okay, again, maybe just bring that down further. Okay, just so we're kind of equaling it out and losing these very dominant areas. It's only supposed to be a subtle variation in the surface, that layer. Okay. The scratches layer is going to be one of the most important, and it's really down to you to decide whether, if the surface is scratched, is it going to be shinier underneath, or is it going to have more of a matte appearance underneath. I think personally we'll leave it so that wherever there's a scratch it's going to be shinier and have more specularity, but this surface here is far too light. It's still going to be very shiny. Right, so I'm going to use the brightness and contrast for this. Let's just bring that, and I'm going to up the brightness first of all just to give some of this white a bit of a boost, and then bring up the contrast. Like so. Now, having done that once, now when I make some more extreme adjustments with the contrast, I'm able to keep a good definition or good level between the darks and the lights. Might just do that one more time. Okay, maybe something like that will be okay. And moving on, we've got the first of the decals. Now, these are going to be the hardest areas really. I'm going to leave the scratches layer on for this. And if we take a look at the decals, you'll notice that we've got areas that will have high specularity and areas that will have barely anything. At the moment, that's even darker than we have the main surface. This isn't right, and we need to find a way of leveling both of these values out. And the simplest way is, once we have the layer selected, is to go adjustments and curves and place a point in the center. Now if we take either of the ends and we reduce this side, we'll start to lighten the blacks, and if we take this side and pull it up, we'll start to darken the whites. Now I'm going for fairly equal level across the whole decal, but I don't want it so bright that it's really going to stand out on the wing. I still want it quite dark, and that's why I've left the scratches layer on, so I'm able to see how dark that is in comparison. I want to bring down the central area a little bit. I've actually just taken that out as well, and you can see that what I've got is going to probably be where I'm looking for. Something like that might be alright. Maybe a bit lighter. If there's any big problems, what I can do is always come back and adjust that. So while I'm doing the decal, might as well do the wing stripe as well. So let's turn that on. Go and have a look. Now this is going to be even easier just because it's black already and we'll need to lighten it. But I'm going to use the curves again as they're fairly quick and easy, and just begin to bring that down, ensuring that trying to get an equal level between the two. A bit much. Okay, let's leave it at that. It should be all right. So you can see the difference between what we started with and now what we're ending up with. Got a couple of layers still to go. We've got the darken layer, the dust layer, and the bullet hole. Let's turn on the darken layer. You can see there's so little going on in that I'm not going to worry about it too much. You can just see it starting to creep in here over the top. Alright, but that's fine. That'll just mean that certain areas of the decal are going to be slightly less specular than others. The bullet hole I may as well do as I'm right up at the top, and to save myself some time, rather than individually altering the specularity for all of these bullet holes, I'm going to take the layers, all 5 of them, and just go layer, merge layers, and now when I make adjustments, of course it's going to affect everything. Got to think how shiny it will be in the surface underneath the paneling. Now for me, I've always kind of thought that might be fairly matte in comparison, so this whole area's got to be pretty dark. To get the look that I want, let's just use the brightness and contrast. I'm going to take the contrast right up and drop the brightness down. You can see that I'm getting a nice kind of highlight around the edge, okay, but I'm still getting a dark center with a slight, again, highlight around where the bullets entered through the paneling completely. So we can just alter that as we like it. Last but not least, we have the 2 dust layers. I'm going to combine these together just while I do this. So go to layer, merge layer. Do ensure that you've switched them on. Merge layers, and rather than being a normal in terms of the blending options, what we're looking for here is the lighten, and it's just far too much. The areas that are the brightest should actually be the darkest, and easiest way, or a way in which we're going to change that, is by using the curves. Pinpoint the center, and we'll make all the lights dark and all the darks light. So, but having done that, you'll notice that the area is too light. Perhaps change the blending options. So let's try normal. Go through something like that multiply layer there. You see how it's darker where we've got the dirt and dust, but we're still not losing a lot of information over the top. It even color burns slightly better. You'll notice that how we created that dust layer, we've got areas missing. We can quite easily fill that in now. In fact, what I'll do is just take the clone tool, pick that area, and just clone across quite roughly. Because this area is so faint, this doesn't have to be too accurate in what I'm doing. I think I'll leave it with the color burn, even though I've slightly darkened up this area by using the clone tool. I think it's going to be alright. We'll go with it and see what it just looks like in Maya. Don't forget, of course, that we need to apply everything back in that we've used. So the rivet layer, the internal rust, we've got the painted rust. Don't worry about the block panel detailing. We've got the panels themselves to place on. And that is everything ready to go. So why not save this? And having done that, we'll layer, flatten image, discard hidden layers, that's fine. File, and go to save as. This will, of course, be our TIFF in the textures and the Mustang spec _01. Now I've reopened the Maya scene that we were using, the _01, that's already got the bump and the color maps applied to the blin. If I take a render of this, just to see what it was like before, we're going to have a before and after. This here is how we left it. So the bumps in, got a specular material on the wing, and we've also got the color. Now what we're going to do is map our specular map we've just created into the specular color. Select the aircraft, go into the attribute editor and to the blin. In specular color, I'm going to go and get the 2D file node and obviously use the Mustang spec _01. It's up to you if you wish to turn the filter on or off. We can see what it looks like with the filter on just for the moment. We save that image and take a render and see the difference between the two. You'll notice now that we've really lost that whole front edge. If you compare the difference, okay, it's quite a lot there that we've lost. We're still keeping some areas, still keeping the scratches, as you can see. Perhaps it's a little bit too dark. Maybe I've gone too far too suddenly and taken too much out. But a nice test that I'd like to do sometimes is to take a light, so create light and directional panels, look through selected, and point it into the scene like that. Let's just take a render, see how that looks. Don't want it too blown out for this. Should be alright. Maybe let's make it a touch brighter, so let's say 1.5. It's alright. Let's just be a little bit pernickety, bring it down 1.35. Right, that'll be okay just for the test. What I'm going to do is actually animate the aircraft slightly and render out an image sequence just to roughly see how the specular highlights looking based upon a very basic lighting setup. So let's just take the aircraft and the whole group, and I'm going to hit S to set a key, frame 30, I'm going to rotate it this way, set a key, frame 60, and bring it back up, set a key, frame 85, I'm going to put it that way, and frame 100 if I want. I can bring it down back to its starting position. So if I just play through that, I've got a banking aircraft. I'm just going to set up my render settings just very basically, as I say, frame 100. I'm going to call this the spec map _01. It's in fact, rather than 01, just going to keep it as spec map AA as the first go. Name.number.extension as a TIFF, frame 1 to 100, perspective camera. Got my production quality, my highest quality, that's fine. And all I need to do, of course, is ensure that my project is definitely set to the correct one, which is now. And then I'm going to render, batch render. And once that's done, we'll come back and we'll take a quick look just to see the result. So the render's done. Let's just go to File and View Sequence, and within your Images folder you should have the specmap_AA. Double click on the first image and that will then load into FCheck. Now based on what I can already see, the texture, the specular map, the bump map's looking alright, but it is of course specific for this scene, and this scene has got one light, so it's not particularly good at all. It's just to get an understanding of how the surface is reacting to light. It's going to be important later on when we take this further and actually light the airplane correctly that we may need to step back and adjust perhaps the specular map. We may need to increase or reduce the bump levels. It's never going to be finished straight away. In the next part of the tutorial, we'll look at texturing the cockpit and how we can export the UVs as a reference image that we can use within Photoshop, and we'll also prepare the propellers and the propeller mount for texturing, again using UVs, projections, and this time the 3D paint tool. Okay, so we'll begin with the propeller mount, and based upon the texturing that we've already done for the wing, what we've really indicated is that wherever objects meet, wherever panels of the surface meet, we're getting areas of rust, and this therefore has to be taken across the whole surface. So where the propellers meet the propeller mount, we would expect perhaps some rust around here, some wear and tear, and the same with at the back. The problem is, as these are separate objects, if we look at the UV map, so window UV texture editor, how are we going to be able to determine where these propellers actually sit? And we're going to do that by creating ourselves a little reference that we'll be able to use in Photoshop. So if we take the propeller, and I'm going to right click and just assign a new material to this, which will just be a Lambert. With it selected, let's go into the rendering, to the texturing menu and the 3D paint tool. Now with that selected, you'll notice that I can't actually paint on the surface yet. I get a warning saying that it has no file texture assigned. Just have to come right down to the bottom and hit assign edit textures. And I'm going to create a texture based upon a resolution size. Now this is the propeller. It's fairly small in comparison to the main body of the aircraft, but even if this is going to be a still image, we may want to indicate the fact that these propellers are rotating, therefore we may add in some motion blur. The thing with adding in motion blur, of course, is that you'll lose a lot of the detailing from the texture anyway, so there's no point spending a large amount of time working on a very big texture that's going to take up unnecessary scene size. Let's keep it at 512 and the image format as TIFF and hit assign edit textures, and I'm going to begin to just paint roughly where the propeller sits onto the propeller mount. Keep on going with that. So take this and this one. Okay, so that is going to be my reference. You may even wish to just tick the back edge so you know where on the UVs is the back where it connects to the fuselage. I'm going to file and save this scene as Mustang_02. Now that's my reference done, and having saved my scene file, it would have created a texture within my 3D Paint Textures folder inside my Maya project. I need to think about the color of this. Now I'm very quickly going to project a ramp onto this surface as we did before with the aircraft, just to ensure that I can get an equal banding. I'm basing this upon one of the reference images that we used, and if I go and open that up now, it's this coloring that I'm aiming to get onto the propeller mount. So I'm going to speed this up as it's a duplication of the method that we were using right at the start of the tutorial with the decals. Right, so that's the texture applied to it. Of course, I need to just bake this out as well. So let's select the object, window, rendering editors, hypershade, select the Lambert, and we're going to go to edit, convert to file texture. This is going to be at 512, okay, to match. Set it as a TIFF, just ensure that it's all right, hit convert and close, and I now have my texture applied onto the surface that I can use in Photoshop. So that is the nose cone prepared. Let's have a look at the propellers. If I just go window, UV texture editor, you'll notice that all of them share the same UV space because they're duplicates. So if I take one UV snapshot, I know that I'll be able to apply the material to all the propellers, and it will fit perfectly. So let's go to polygons, UV snapshot. I'm going to keep this as 512 as well, and just call it propeller, out UV 512. Hit OK. So these are my snapshots that I'm now taking out that I can use as a reference to say, right, okay, well, I know that the tip of the propeller is here on the UVs, and therefore if I want that red, I can paint that area red in Photoshop. So the propeller mount's ready to go, the propeller's ready to go. It's just a case of doing the cockpit. So we'll take the rear section, polygons, UV snapshot, cockpit rear, out UV. Again, well, let's give this 1024 just for this section. Okay, hit OK, and then we'll take the front, which again I'm going to call the cockpit, but this time the front, out UV 1024, and OK. So I've now extracted all the UVs that I'll need, and I've prepared the propeller mount and the propellers ready for texturing. So let's leave Maya for the moment and go back into Photoshop. Back in Photoshop, I'm just going to file open, and within the images folder of my project, I've got the 3 UV snapshots I've taken. I'll begin with the cockpit rear out UV, And this of course represents the back area of the cockpit. Now why we use the UV snapshots is really due to accuracy when we're creating our textures. If we wanted to place a specific area of detail, perhaps it was a specific area of bump, specularity, even transparency, we know that if we work to these guidelines or the UV layout, when we apply the texture to a material in Maya, the detail will sit exactly where we require it. Now I'm going to use this very basically just to demonstrate how we could map transparency, which is something that we haven't covered yet within the tutorials. And having done this, it will then be your opportunity to go away and take on board how you can use these UVs and create your own textures for the rest of this and also the propellers and the front of the cockpit, bearing in mind that we will need the color map, a bump map, a specular map, and wherever there's glass, as there is in here, a transparency map. Now how will a transparency map work? Well, wherever we have the color black, the surface will be see-through, it will have 100% transparency, and wherever it's white, we will not be able to see through it at all, and it will be 100% opaque. Now as we're using this just as a reference, I'm not going to be taking this UV snapshot back into Maya as part of my texture. I'm going to keep it in here, and then when I'm ready I'll just hide it or discard it when creating the final TIFF. With regards to this area then of the aircraft, I know that this border area is going to be metal, right? It's a combination of metal and glass that we have to deal with here. And the metal starts at the border edge that we have and will come into this UV layout up to the second loop here. So all of this area will be metal and therefore opaque. Everything else will be see-through or transparent. So let's begin by creating the areas that will be 100% transparent. We of course know that that is going to be a black area, so let's create a new layer, and just for the purpose of the tutorial I'm going to create this very quickly using a polygon lasso tool and select the area inside the layout line or the edge loop that we have. Right, kind of missed a little bit out there, so I'm just going to add into that using the rectangular marquee. Right, and within that I'll need to just fill that with a black layer. So just edit fill, foreground color, and that's now black. I can save myself a bit of time here and just Control Shift and I to invert the selection, create a new layer, and this layer will be white. So what I have there is the very basic transparency that I will require in order to have an area of glass and an area of metal. But let's make it slightly more interesting. What would happen if I wanted to place across the surface perhaps an oil splatter? Well, within the source images and the texture reference, you'll find an image here called the oil splatter. If you open that up, we're going to use this to not only help us affect the transparency across the glass, but we can also use it as part of a color map. So let's just drag that in, and I'm going to need to scale it quite a bit just to begin with. Let's try 20% at first, bring it in, place it at an angle so it runs across the surface, maybe a bit bigger. So that's going to be my oil smear. In fact, it would probably run slightly straighter down the side perhaps. But the problem is this is red, and obviously oil isn't red, it's black, but we can't use the colors. What we're looking for is a black and white to help us here. So I would automatically go to the image adjustments, the black and white, and just pull all of the red out of that image. Now the darker you have it, the more opaque it will be. If you have a mid-grey, you're going to have semi-transparency where the oil is. So if you wanted a very light smear, you'd perhaps have something like so. I, on the other hand, want something that's quite bold, quite solid, thick oil, thick engine oil down the side of the window. I'm just going to drop all of those just in case and hit OK. And then I need to invert this image, because at the moment what we've got is an area across the surface that's going to be transparent, then opaque, and where the oil is going to be transparent. So let's image adjustments, invert, and there is a perfect map for the oil. Just going to come and check out a couple of areas. You can see that we may have a slight problem in some of the corners. You've always got to double check things like that. Just going to use the rubber and just quickly get rid of it. Just ensure that we haven't got anything that we don't want. And that now is our transparency map created. So I'm going to flatten the image now and just file save as a TIFF within the textures and call this the cockpit rear out UV underscore 01 to match the name, and hit OK, or save rather. The image compression, always keep that at none, and we're good to go. Back for the last time in Maya, I'm going to take the rear cockpit here, right click, assign a blend into the transparency. I'm going to take the map we've just created in Photoshop, the cockpit rear out UV, plug that in, and if I want to see the high quality rendering of it, let's just select that, and it will take a moment just to think, and we get this. Now it's not what we were expecting. The reason is you may find that within the image we've got an embedded alpha. By that I mean it's using an alpha for the transparency rather than the color. So there's two things that we can do. We can change in the color balance and say we want the alpha to be used as the luminance, and then we get the correct result. Or of course we can go back into Photoshop, and within the channels we would just tear that alpha out of the image. In the long run I would prefer to go back into Photoshop and remove it, but as this is just a test, we can switch to alpha as luminance and still see the result that we're getting. And you can now see for yourselves how the black and white map will affect the transparency of the cockpit. So following on from the transparency, we've looked also at the specular, we've looked at the bump map, we've looked at creating color maps, we've looked at extracting the UV information within a UV snapshot, we've looked at projecting textures, baking textures. The rest of the project now is entirely up to you. It's about taking what you've learned, practicing it, learning the skills, and completing the rest of the plane. Now I've used this as an example. There's nothing stopping you from going back, starting again, using your own decals, using your own colors, getting your own reference, and really making this plane yours. Okay, you want to practice and learn based upon something that is individually yours. You'll find you'll enjoy it more, and you'll be more proud of it as well at the end, rather than being partly done while watching a tutorial. So do continue. What I'm going to do is just close this down, and I will show you an example of the completed aircraft.